If you've been listening along for a while, you'll know I'm all about staying sharp, physically and mentally. As I get older, staying on top of my game means being smarter with how I support my body and mind day in, day out. One product I've already added to my routine from the bulk nutrients range is their NMN Extend. It's a science-backed blend of 10 powerful ingredients, including NMN, resveratrol, and hyaluronic acid. Now, this is designed to support everything from energy and muscle recovery to skin hydration, joint health, and even mental clarity. And by the way, I need all those. Whether I'm powering through a busy week or just investing in my long-term health, NMN Extend help me stay ready for whatever's next. And believe me, it tastes pretty good too. Head to bulknutrients.com.au and see why NMN Extend might be the edge you just been looking for. Dr. Deveni, welcome to Project 100.
Thank you.
So our normal process is we ask our guest if they wouldn't mind explaining their qualifications because particularly when they have a medical background, this is important for our audience to know who they're listening to because I am by no means near an expert in any of the topics that we discuss here. I'm just an interviewer. And you're the expert. So could you please tell us what your qualifications are?
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
I have a medical degree.
Yep.
I went to medical school back in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, actually. And then since then, I trained in neurology. So I am a cognitive neurologist. And I also did a PhD. So when I came to Sydney, almost 13 years ago, I came to do a fellowship and then fell in love with the place, fell in love with the work and all of that and decided to stay. And so then I did a PhD here at UNSW. So I have a medical degree and then also a doctorate.
And you're currently at Neura?
At Neura, yeah.
So what do you do at Neura?
Well, at Neura, I have a variety of roles. That includes the sort of clinical work, so, clinical neurology, particularly in the cognitive field and looking after people with dementia, diagnosing people with dementia, looking after them. Also in my role, I am now leading an international project. I'm leading the Sydney site. The international project is called DIAN. That stands for Dominantly Inherited Alzheimer's Network. So that's funded through Washington University in the US by the NIH, which is the National Institute of Health, and a variety of other funders. And that's a project that's been going on about 20 years now.
So it's like a longitudinal study.
Longitudinal study. It started off as a longitudinal study back in 2008. And in fact, Sydney here was one of the first sites at Neura. And what that aims to do is that aims to track people with a genetic form of Alzheimer's disease. This is a rare form of Alzheimer's disease. It usually affects people in their 30s, 40s, 50s.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. And what it does is it tracks them before they develop the disease. So these people give their time and effort up when they're in their 20s and 30s, and we're able to follow them over time, looking at biomarkers, looking at neuroimaging to try and understand how the disease progresses. And that's been really instrumental, actually, in how we understand Alzheimer's disease. And then more recently, that has become there's been an arm of that, which is a trials unit. So we're actually been treating these people, trying to treat them at the very early stages of dementia, or in fact, before it even begins, to see can we prevent the disease. So I've been really fortunate to come to Neura at a really exciting time where I'm now the principal investigator for the DIAN study at Sydney. That's one of my major roles.
It sounds pretty exciting.
At the moment. Yeah, it really is.
Particularly, in an intellectual sense or an academic sense with practical applications.
Absolutely. And we're starting to see, real life impacts, and it is, from an academic perspective, really exciting. It's a wonderful time to be in cognitive neurology, but also it's really special to be part of these family stories. And I think, that's something which I didn't expect, but has been really profound.
There's a massive intimacy in that.
There is.
That they let you into their brain.
Exactly.
Not just in their front door, but really actually in their front door, straight inside.
Right inside. And, we learn about family relationships, dynamics. We become really enmeshed in everything that's going on in their lives. And it's a privilege, and they share They share things with us that maybe they don't feel comfortable sharing with other people, maybe with other health professionals, because we've developed this sort of deep, connection and relationship. And even just last week, actually, for the very first time, we organised a family conference for all of the families from Australia and New Zealand to come together to Neura. And this usually happens every year actually in the US, but our families could never make it there. So there was a big push to do it here on this side of the world. So we did it, and it was amazing.
Just for when you say cognitive, well, you're talking about Alzheimer's, but does it include other things like Parkinson's or MND, motor neuron disease, etc., or we're just talking about here just Alzheimer's?
This was just for Alzheimer's
So this
disease.
DIAN is just Alzheimer's.
DIAN is just
Yeah.
Alzheimer's disease. But I think it's a great model for us to explore how we think about motor neuron disease, how we think about Parkinson's disease, because, in all of these conditions, of course, we want to be able to treat people, but probably where we're going to make the biggest impact is prevention, stopping these disease processes from even starting in the first place.
Or even hopefully just slow them down.
Or slowing them down, exactly, because we know. Take Alzheimer's disease, for example, and I'm using that as a model because that's where we have the most information. We know that these changes start in our brain 20 to 30 years before symptoms start. So there's a huge window of opportunity that we can perhaps intervene. And I think taking this approach that we have in Alzheimer's disease, where we can track people before they develop the symptoms, if we take that approach and we apply that to motor neuron disease. So, for example,
As a model.
And motor neuron disease, the majority of cases aren't genetic, same as Alzheimer's disease, but there are a number of cases that are. And there's the C9orf72 expansion, for example, that explains a lot of genetic forms of motor neuron disease. And what we're actually trying to do at Neura, and what we have been doing, is studying these people as well with these genetic forms of motor neuron disease way before they might develop symptoms. So we can have a similar approach. We can identify markers of progression. We can work out what is the very first step. What is the very first step to set off the sort of cascade for the development of these diseases.
When usually it's too late. And you have mentioned, Emma, a few times, excuse me, you have mentioned a few times Neura. Of course, we had your fearless leader, Matt Kiernan, on there, the CEO of Neura. And but maybe quickly just explain to our audience what Neura is. It's relatively speaking quite a new initiative over the last few years. But what does Neura do? So Neura itself, the institution where you are now based.
Yes, so Neura is primarily a research institute, but it has really strong connections with the University of New South Wales, and importantly with the local health districts. So, with the clinics, with the clinical space. So Neura is essentially involved in neuroscience, the science behind neurology in essence. And Neura focuses on three main pillars. Those are neurodegeneration, which we're talking about now, also mental health, psychiatry, which neurodegeneration and psychiatry are actually really quite intricately linked as well. And then another pillar focusing on translation. And I think that's, the key. What Neura really can do and is doing is it's taking this science, all of these learnings, and then translating it into something meaningful. And that's ultimately what we want to do. We want to be able to influence, the patient's journey. We want people to be diagnosed earlier, be diagnosed better, have better treatments. And that's the essence of what Neura does. It's working to really translate that science. How do we take that science into the clinic to change our patients' lives for the better? And then how do we influence policy and all of that?
For me, what a great job, but not for everybody. But so because this is sort of a dense topic, and we'll put it this way: I have an opportunity to ask somebody who's an expert in the density of the topic when it comes to Alzheimer's / dementia, MND. We probably will spend more time on the former, Alzheimer's / dementia. if that's okay with
Yeah.
you. But because it's dense, I've actually had to I had our chief science officer write up the questions for me, who happens to be a neuroscientist. But I'm going to ask a lot of questions that she has organised for us. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I want to make sure that I get the right or the most amount of content out of you, if that's okay,
Mm-hmm.
that is relevant to our audience, the sort of things people want to know, if you don't mind. So some of these questions aren't going to look like a normal podcast where I'm normally just having a conversation. I'm going to have to sort of lean into these questions a little bit, and I'll try and explain the question a little bit, and then I'll leave the answer obviously over to you. But and the first question that I've had is the first question I have here is what's around the heading of science and neurodegeneration. Now, we know that there are a number of things that, unfortunately, one of four things is ultimately going to get us. So either going to be a brain disease or degeneration of the brain, neurodegeneration, or it could be heart, which is the most prevalent one around the world. It could be cancer, which is the second most prevalent around the world. But neurodegeneration is the third, the fourth being metabolic diseases, which obviously I'm going to talk about. But when it comes to neurodegeneration, and in particular with relation to Alzheimer's / dementia, and I'll ask you to please split those two up and tell me what the difference between the two is, and MD, what actually is happening to the brain? Like, we can, if I get a skin cancer, I can see it I can see it. At least it's sort of present, and someone probably can get a microscope and show me even what's going on underneath my skin. But with the brain, it's a bit more difficult. There are definitely no outward signs that I can see. I can probably hear it, or I can feel it, or I can sense it, but I can't see it. So what's actually happening in the brain during those two diseases? And if you wouldn't mind just quickly letting us know what the difference between Alzheimer's and dementia is.
Okay, I'll start with that
Yeah.
maybe. So dementia is a broad term. It's like the umbrella term. Basically, it means neurodegeneration, but it's the outward symptoms of it, I guess. Someone who has a neurodegenerative disorder and as a result has impairment in their function, so they can't do what they normally could do. And that's just that broad term. And then underneath that sits the various types of dementia. Alzheimer's disease being the most common.
So that's a form of dementia.
It's a form of dementia.
Uh-huh.
Similarly, frontotemporal dementia, form of dementia,
FTD.
FTD, associated with motor neuron disease in some cases, and tends to affect younger people, under the age of 65. And then we've got other forms of dementia like Lewy body dementia, which is related to Parkinson's disease.
So Parkinson's disease can result in dementia.
Absolutely.
As well.
Yeah, and the same. And then we've also got vascular dementia
Which
as
is
well.
because that's up. Usually it's like a problem with your arteries. You basically blood stops flowing up to your brain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Very similar to what happens with ischemic heart disease.
Yeah.
You develop angina and heart attacks. The same process happens in those vessels that supply the brain.
Which is the more common one out of all of those? I think you just cited four things.
So Alzheimer's disease would be the most common.
Right.
And what each of those, they're distinguished by their symptoms, but primarily by the underlying pathology, by, as you refer to, what's actually happening inside the brain. And that's what defines the differences. That's how we define them. And they all have their own sort of unique set of symptoms, but they often overlap. So there can be a little bit of diagnostic difficulty in splitting them out, certainly from a clinical perspective, certainly from just sitting here and talking. But Alzheimer's disease is the most common, but many people have co-pathologies.
So they have some of each.
They have some of
Or
each.
one or two, or
Alzheimer's
perhaps.
disease and vascular dementia are really closely linked, and often a lot of the risk factors are similar for both, actually. And even the pathology that we see in the Lewy body dementia, the Parkinson's disease type, it's called alpha-synuclein, and we actually see that quite commonly in Alzheimer's disease as well. And we used to think that perhaps that was because they're all disorders of aging. And if we look at older people's brains and we see all these pathologies, but what we've seen from our work in the younger onset dementia, particularly the genetic forms of Alzheimer's disease, is that these people also have that alpha-synuclein pathology in their brains,
What is
even
that?
when
What
they're
is
20
that?
and
What is this
30.
pathology? What do you mean? What would you see?
S-
What would
So
you see if you're
when
looking through an MRI or whatever the case may be?
yeah. So the pathology refers to the disease like within the actual brain structures, and those are usually abnormal proteins. And these are proteins that are made by the brain and are usually cleared out, or sometimes how they're made can become a bit defective. But when we look at an MRI scan, we don't see that. We
You
can't
don't,
see that protein. We can't
right.
see that
So
actual
the MRI can't pick the
pathology.
protein up.
It can't pick up the protein, but we do now have different type of imaging called PET scans, where we can actually see some of these
So we
proteins.
put something in our veins, some sort of color, and whatever it is
Exactly.
attaches to that particular protein and lights it up.
Exactly. Take a picture and we can see it. So that's been a relatively new discovery, but that is transforming, how we diagnose and how we treat these conditions. And I think it going back to that initial question you asked me about what's happening
Yeah.
in the brain in Alzheimer's disease or in dementia. And I think to think about that, we think about, well, how the brain is composed. And the brain is made up of billions of nerve cells, called neurons. I think there are like 86 billion nerve
Whoa.
cells. Yeah. I've actually looked this up just to confirm recently because I was talking to my son about it and he was asking me lots of questions. So I had to refresh my memory. But yes, there are around 86 billion nerve cells. But each of those nerve cells are connected to thousands of other nerve cells. So they're all interconnected. And particularly for cognition, memory, language, and behavior, those nerve cells are all sort of connected to each other in a network. So it's not just one specific set of nerve cells, of neurons. It's actually a whole connection of nerve cells which subserve those cognitive processes. So, for example, memory. So, your memory predominantly sits in a structure called the hippocampus, which is deep in that temporal lobe, so here. And the hippocampus is like a seahorse shaped structure. And that is where the majority of the sort of the memory cells sit. But that hippocampus is connected through neurons throughout the entirety of the brain, right back to the posterior part of the brain and right around. So we have this whole network of nerve cells, if you can imagine, and that's what's controlling memory, for example. And then what happens in these types of conditions is that these nerve cells, one nerve cell, collection of nerve cells, dies. And that's because an abnormal protein is deposited in it or deposited around it. So that cell dies.
And if I just stop you there for a second, why does, when that protein, which our body's producing anyway, but maybe our brain fails to clear out for some reason, why does the nerve cell die as a result of that protein? Is the protein like poisonous or bashes it up, or what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, it becomes toxic, I guess,
Right.
because there's either too much of it. So the nerve cell can't function. Its metabolism, its nutrition can't function if there's too much of this
So it gets
protein
overwhelmed.
building. Yeah, like getting overwhelmed, exactly.
But why do we
Exactly.
produce the protein in the first place?
So we produce all of these proteins, and they each have their own potential function within the cell. So, for example, one of the proteins that are produced in Alzheimer's disease is called tau.
TAU.
TAU. And there we have amyloid and we have tau.
Yeah.
And tau actually is really important for the structure of the nerve cells.
You mean it's like a building block of the nerve cell?
Exactly,
Yeah. That helps
exactly.
the nerve cells sort of regenerate or perhaps have that structure that they need.
Have that structure that they need, and they need that structure in order to process the signals that sort of move along the nerves from one nerve to the next. So actually that protein is really, it's a part of the cell. It's important, but in Alzheimer's disease, it becomes disrupted and it changes to a different form of tau, and that form of tau is toxic to the cells, and it builds up.
Why
It
would our
builds up
body
in
do that to
between
us?
the
Why
cells.
would our brain produce this thing that's changed in its structure, molecular structure, what a chemical structure, whatever it is, is that like, I don't know, why?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the million-dollar
You don't know.
question, isn't it?
Okay.
But I think, one thing to say is that these nerve cells are really extremely powerful, but they're also really fragile.
Yeah.
And, we have evolved over time, as a species, I guess, to have these really highly evolved cognitive processes and these nerve cells that can subserve that. And perhaps there's something about that. There's something about that evolutionary aspect to it that makes these cells particularly vulnerable.
Yeah, they're too well evolved and perhaps maybe too sensitive, and as a result of being sensitive, that they can get damaged quite easily.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. An interesting proposition or hypothesis. But I guess there's the sorts of things you're trying to research and prove up over time with all your collaborations. So it's if I could just go back a step in relation to the 4 different types of strands that fit under the umbrella of dementia. And I think it's a terrible word because like dementia sort of makes out someone's demented. Like maybe they can ultimately be that way because they don't know what they're doing and like have a sort of a madness, like in a terrible sort of movie sense. But it's just a terrible word, dementia. Anyway. And I actually understand it for people over 60, males over 60 is the most researched word on the internet.
Okay.
Yeah, most researched word. Dementia is for men over 60, but because it has created a whole lot of concern and worry. Like everybody over 60 seems to be worried about this because they don't want to lose their marbles, basically. It's probably not, that's a very crude way of speaking to a scientist. But but that's sort of, but if I could just look at the 4 prongs, if I just look at them, and I'd like to, for the audience purposes, which is sort of mine too, just simplify it. So probably the only one I can understand, or can't really understand, but I can sort of put a label on is vascular dementia. And the only reason why I know that one is because one of my uncles has vascular dementia, and I spoke at length to Matthew Kinnan about it. And basically, like your arteries that feed blood and oxygen and nutrients up to your brain, if they get blocked, brain cells, neurons, stop getting fed, and they can die off. And if you lose them in the wrong spot, I guess, in relation to, say, memory area, or your speech, or whatever the case may be, or just the ability to make decision-making part of your brain, that is how you get vascular dementia. Is that correct? Sort of in a crude way.
In a nutshell, yes, essentially. And that's often how I will explain it to patients.
Oh, really? Okay.
It is that sort of that accelerated aging as such of our vessels. And when we're young, we have these beautiful smooth vessels, and the blood flows through it, and a really lovely manner. But as we age, those vessels change. Part of normal aging, but that can be accelerated
through that. But lifestyle can accelerate that too.
Exactly.
And Matthew explained to me is what's good for your heart in relation to vascular dementia. What's good for your heart is good for your brain. So basically a good healthy lifestyle. Which may mean you don't have any heart conditions. What I mean by that is plaque and clogging up and stuff like that. Could also be good to help you at least manage your way through getting vascular dementia. Smoking, alcohol, crap food, no exercise, etc. So, but where does, in terms of vascular dementia, where does genetics fit in? So, in other words, having inherited tendency to have these things. Where does that fit in?
I agree with all of those points that you made, and I think all the lifestyle factors are extremely important. But the one thing that we can't change is genetics.
Yep.
We're born with that. It's sort of what we're given, and then we have to work with it. Certainly for vascular dementia, I think there's a significant component there.
Oh, really?
It's not inherited in the way of some of these genes we talk about for motor neuron disease, for example, or for Alzheimer's disease, in that if your parent has it, you have a 50% chance of developing it. But I think definitely there's lots of evidence there to say that these vascular phenomenon are definitely have a genetic a genetic component to it. And we see that particularly in younger people who are affected by strokes.
Oh, wow.
For example, you can see that clustering of strokes just within certain families. So yeah, I think genetics does play a part in it.
And then it's, as I understand it, for vascular dementia, it's sort of fairly simple to go and get a carotid Doppler, an ultrasound done on your carotid arteries. It takes like
Yeah,
20 minutes or
yeah,
10 minutes or whatever. And they can at least sort of tell you, listen, hey, Mark, you've got, those arteries are starting to clog up a bit, and we'll maybe ever give you some medication to do something about it, or maybe there's some intervention. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I think, yes, often that can be okay, right, now I need to do something. It can be
Yeah.
that sort of defining moment,
Yeah.
can't it, where, right, okay, I'm at that stage now, I can see my lifestyle or whatever environmental factors are having an effect on my body and my health. So often it can be that defining moment to step in and make a change. Obviously, it would depend on the degree of blockage. So if you have what would be called a critical stenosis, and that it's there is sufficiently reduced blood flow going through that carotid artery, for example,
Up to the brain.
Up to the brain. Then in some cases that might require actually a procedure where you can put a stent in there.
Yeah, open it
Like
up.
you put a stent in the coronary arteries and open them up. So that's a possibility. Also, it can just give you an idea of what your vessels potentially look like. And also we can do, when we do an MRI brain, we can actually see some of the effects of that clogging up of the arteries, not just the carotid arteries, but also the vasculature right within the brain. Those, as the arteries move through the brain, they get smaller and smaller. So any disruption in blood flow can have a significant impact as those vessels get smaller. But when we look at an MRI in someone who has significant vascular disease, we often see a lot of what we call little white dots. And those are the effect of the vascular disease.
Plaque?
It's like I guess it's like little areas of where the brain has died, where the cells have died. They're tiny.
But you can see it?
But we can see it.
Do you have to put some sort of DIAN in the system, or does it to light it up, or you can see it just in an MRI? You can see the little white dots or whatever it is.
Yeah, but on an MRI, they use different sequences to look at different structures, or to look at the white matter or the grey matter in more detail. So there are a number of different sequences that they use in the MRI, and some of them make water bright, some of them make fat bright, some of them make tissue bright. So there's a specific sequence, which is part of a typical MRI, where you can see quite clearly these sort of we call them chronic microvascular changes.
So if somebody's in their family has an uncle or an auntie, whatever, or mum and dad, whatever the case may be, who has been diagnosed with vascular dementia or perhaps even passed away, and let's say they're in their 30s, what should they ask their doctor, their GP?
So I think that for them, I think they need to be thinking about having a sort of vascular sort of checkup with their GP. One thing they need to talk to their GP about is smoking. If they smoke, they should most definitely stop, because we know smoking definitely contributes to those white dots. Checking their blood pressure, having their cholesterol checked. Those things are really important. Maybe every so often having a test for sort of diabetes or pre-diabetes.
So is there some relationship between diabetes and vascular dementia?
Absolutely. And even between diabetes and Alzheimer's disease.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I think that speaks to the metabolic aspect of all of these neurodegenerative conditions, because we talk about abnormal proteins. Absolutely, this is the pathology, that's what's happening in the brain, but there are lots of other factors involved as well. What kicks off that pathology? Why in Alzheimer's disease can we not clear that amyloid or tau pathology as well as we should do? So there are other factors involved in sort of kicking those processes off, and that might be neuroinflammation, for example. And we know diabetes and metabolic disorders are really intricate in terms of neuroinflammation, particularly in relation to neurodegeneration. And in fact, maybe I'm jumping on a little bit here, but actually there are some clinical trials happening at the moment using weight loss, the GLP-1.
Yep. Ozempic.
Ozempic.
As an example of GLP-1.
Yep. In early Alzheimer's disease.
You mean as an assistance to not getting it, or it causes it? Well, I don't understand.
So these clinical trials are in early Alzheimer's disease. So people who already have
A diagnosis.
Yeah, and sort of the buildup of the protein.
Yep.
And the question is, can these drugs slow down that process of protein buildup, or can they help clear out some of that amyloid? And how might they do that? And I think that is because those drugs are also used for diabetes, and I think it's
originally
exactly, and it's targeting that potential neuroinflammation, and how that interacts with these abnormal proteins in the brain.
So let's now move on to the more complicated, from my point of view at least, the more complicated ones. So let's move on to probably the next popular one, that in my mind anyway, Alzheimer's. You mentioned a build-up of tau and build-up of amyloids, and you mentioned that tau is an important protein in the brain. I guess amyloid is too, for the same reason. But somehow we're doing it too fast or too much, or not clearing it, or what's being produced is a little bit crazy because it's not quite the right, somehow varied. In terms of okay, so and that's happening. So what does that do? Is it sort of only stop our memory, or because Alzheimer's is sort of associated with I can't remember something, or I can't remember someone's name, because like I'm this person, like I'm not young, but I'm this person, like I can't remember a person's name, even though, but I will remember it a bit later on. And I remember again Matthew saying to me, "Don't worry, that's more memory loss through like anxiety, brain anxiety, like memory anxiety, as opposed to," because I know so many people say this. My God, I reckon I'm getting Alzheimer's. It's like, just can't remember something or other. It's not that I forgot where my keys are. I can't remember someone's name, or I can't remember that. Or sometimes you can't remember a word. You're searching in your brain for this word. When do we start to get worried that we might be getting Alzheimer's disease? I mean.
And I think that's really common, and we see a lot of people in the clinic, especially in midlife, starting to worry about, those sorts of cognitive symptoms that maybe they've experienced before but haven't put it as much salience on it.
And midlife being like 40 plus.
40 plus, yeah. I think the definition of midlife is a bit open.
Right.
But yeah, from 40 onwards, we tend to see that. When should we start getting worried about it? Well, we know in Alzheimer's disease, for example, the very first deficit that we see is in learning, is the ability to learn something new. And often that doesn't usually manifest in people's day-to-day life, but often we can see people start to struggle at work. Perhaps they've been going along, everything's been fine, and then something new is introduced in work, maybe new software. They have to learn a new curriculum, a new skill, exactly. Yeah. And that's when people start to struggle. So that can often be one of the very first features, is that problem with learning.
So, Emma, could you mind if you would just explain, what do you mean by learning? So, let's say I'm learning new software in the business that I'm running or I'm involved in. I might be an IT guy or girl, and they say, "Look, we've got some new software which we're now going to get 10 licenses for the organisation." It might be something about how you use AI to build marketing programs or something like that. How would I know that I can't learn that? Like, is it like it just it's a fog, or what is it? What symptom am I thinking about?
Well, yeah, and people do describe it as a fog sometimes, and I think it just becomes more difficult to do it. It feels more cognitively difficult. People are really struggling to learn the concept, where before maybe you might have picked it up really quickly, but people are really struggling to and then to integrate that into their day-to-day life so often, or into their day-to-day work life. So something that might have, taken them a short time with the old software is now taking a really long time to do with this new software, for example.
And then do those people present to you guys at Neura, in the clinic part of the business?
Yeah, often
And
they
who
will.
sends them there? Their doctor, or do they find you? How does it work?
I think it's a combination, people who are very self-aware. People, as you say, are becoming more aware of Alzheimer's disease, of dementia in general, and their risk. So people will go out there and try to find information, try to find specialist people who might be able to help them. But then also, GPs, general practitioners, and also other specialists if there are sort of more complicated cases, particularly people who might have genetic forms, young forms of dementia. Other specialists might refer them through to us as well.
So, and when these people come in, do you put them through a test? Because obviously they're giving you some observation that they've observed. But do you have a testing program? We sort of put them through cognitive tests. Ask them to learn a new formula or something. And see how they perform.
Yeah, we have every assessment is slightly different. As every person is different, and they have different concerns, and they might come with family members or by themselves. But essentially, a lot of it is history taken, and that's a huge part of what we do as neurologists. Sit down with the person, take the time to listen to their story, read between the lines as well. We'll talk to family members as well, usually separately, to give them the opportunity to really explain how life has changed for them. And then usually we do a variety of bedside assessments. So for example, I will often show people a number of different animals, actually little animals, and we ask people to name them. Some of them are sort of rare animals that you might not necessarily,
like an armadillo or something.
Exactly. And then we ask them
Thank
questions.
God I got that right.
Yeah. We ask different questions, and this is just one example. But you can actually get a lot of learning from that. You can actually learn a lot about where the person is at. We can understand. We can learn about language. We can learn about comprehension. We can learn about memory. There's a whole host of cognitive functions that we can get from those simple sort of bedside tests. And then we have more standardized cognitive assessments. We have screening tools, and then we can do more detailed neuropsychological assessments. So for example, if it was someone with language impairment, we have this battery of tests that we can really sort of nut down on, try and get to the bottom of where actually the problem is in language, and then that helps us understand what might be driving it.
Would you then say, look, we've got to come to this conclusion, we're going to put you in under an MRI machine and have a look at your brain?
Yeah, that's usually
Would seem to be the gold standard at the end of the day, is it?
Yeah. Usually, often people will come having already had an MRI.
Right.
We like to look at them ourselves. We're looking for specific patterns of. So the MRI looks at the structure of the brain. It doesn't tell you anything about what the brain's doing, but it tells you what the structure is. So, if, for example, we have a patient with frontotemporal dementia, and when we look at their brain scans, we see changes. We see what we call atrophy, which is shrinkage in the front and the temporal parts of the brain.
It's around the temporal side?
Yeah,
or
and
is it
the front and the temporal,
right?
So around those regions.
Yep.
So each dementia syndrome has its own specific pattern that we see on MRI.
Right,
So
and yeah, I get that. So, do you ask them, for example, when it comes to Alzheimer's, do you ask them, for example, have they suffered brain trauma?
Yeah, we do.
Like, for example, let's say somebody had been a rugby league player or a rugby union player or a boxer. Is that important, brain injury?
That is important. I believe that is important. And I think, that opens a whole other box, in terms of research. And, we know a little bit about it. Definitely, we ask people about it. And I've seen quite a few people come through who have, been in the professional sort of realm, different
Contact sports.
contact sports, come through who now have a diagnosis of dementia or Alzheimer's disease. People often want to know, did this cause it? Right now, we can't tell them that. We don't know for definite, but certainly it does seem to be a risk factor.
So it would appear to be relatable, but not necessarily causative. So, in other words, it's in so many percentage of the cases, you can maybe be able to show that there has been a brain injury for so many percentage of the cases, but you can't say that that's what's caused those cases. Those
Yeah,
40%.
we can't say for definite. And that sort of merges then into, well, head injury, is that a risk? That's a risk factor for the development of Alzheimer's disease and amyloid pathology. But then we have CTE,
Yeah.
and that's a different pathology, but we can't diagnose. The only way we can tell if that pathology is there is when we look at the brain under a microscope.
Yeah.
So in life, we can't
Yeah.
tell
So that's
that.
that's what you only look at it once they've passed away.
Yes,
When you
yeah.
get you actually get access to the brain.
And that's the way it used to be for Alzheimer's disease.
Oh, really?
Before we had these methods of identifying the protein, for example, on the PET scans that we talked about earlier, where we give people a tracer. We take a tracer for amyloid or tau, and we take photos of the brain, and we can see the amyloid and the tau. Or we can take a little sample of the fluid that surrounds the brain and the spinal cord. So we do a lumbar puncture. I don't know if you've ever had one of those.
Yeah, I know what they are.
Yeah.
They're
People
pretty freaky.
Yeah, people don't love them.
Yeah.
They don't enjoy them.
So
I've never
it's at the
had
back
one.
of the head here, at the back of the neck.
Bottom of the bottom of the back.
Bottom of the back, yeah.
Yeah. And you can take some of that, and that fluid that you take out, that fluid cushions the brain and the spinal cord, so it's really close to the brain, and you can actually measure those proteins in that fluid. So that way we can tell what pathology is in the brain. So we can do that for Alzheimer's disease, but we can't yet do that for some of the other conditions.
So Alzheimer's disease is traditionally known as sort of like if I put it into normal parlance, it's like forgetfulness or loss of memory, where people don't even know who someone is in the room. Like, for example, I may have been married to you my whole life, but one day I don't even know who you are, and I might not even recognise my kids. When they are in this condition, do they know that potentially they don't recognise their kids? Are these people aware that they might not be aware this particular person is my child, but do they think to themselves, oh, maybe that is my child and I don't recognise him? Do they understand? Can they understand that much? Or is it just a memory thing that they've lost? And do they get depressed or a bit, feel terrible?
Those are all really interesting considerations, I think, and something that's important for us to think about as well. What is that person with Alzheimer's disease actually experiencing?
Yeah.
And Alzheimer's disease is more than just memory. And as is, many of the other types of dementia as well, it also affects their behavior.
Because I've heard some can be quite violent and angry.
Angry and agitated.
Yeah.
And that is part of the condition. And that is because it's the disease itself is changing their brain. It's changing those connections. It's changing those networks. And it's ultimately making people less tolerant, but it's actually a part of the disease. And I think that's really important for people to understand, because that can often be quite detrimental to relationships. People think, oh, they hate me, they don't like me, we've lost our bond and all of those things. And I think it's really important for people to understand that it's not them. It's not the person themselves, it's the disease, and that's what's driving it.
I have a friend who's, he's not old, well, he's in his 60s, but unfortunately had to go to a home because he has Alzheimer's disease. Had to go to a home because he was sort of very aggressive towards his family, and but probably doesn't even know it's his family, and probably doesn't even really know what he's doing. And unfortunately, it was too dangerous for everybody to be present because and he had to be sort of, let's call it, put into a place where they could manage him. But like, I got a shock when I heard about it, but because he was never like that his whole life. No, it's just not that person, not that person. Maybe we just talk about MND? MND is one close to my mind because my heart, because my mother passed away from motor neuron disease, or ALS. And actually, that's where I first met Matthew Kiernan at when he was at the other place, Brain Mind Centre. It's a bit more complex to me, it seems to me. Well, not complex, a little less understood perhaps. But maybe you can just explain there's a couple of forms of motor neuron disease, but maybe you just explain to our audience what motor neuron disease is, and or otherwise known as MND.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm sorry to hear about your mum.
It's the worst disease to watch someone suffer.
I know.
She was lucky she didn't get it until she's 86. I also would like you to include in that the genetic part of it, because it only accounts for a small percentage, as I understand it, of people who get it, and a lot of people can get it without mutations on their genes. So, but maybe you can explain both those.
Yeah, sure, of course. So what is motor neuron disease? Well, and it also, motor neuron disease has a few names, also known as ALS.
Yep.
ALS is actually the most common form of motor neuron disease. So motor neuron disease is that umbrella term.
Yep.
And then sitting underneath that, we have ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, which is the most common type. And then we have some other types, bulbar, which predominantly affects the speech and the swallowing muscles. And then we have two other variants. One is PLS, which primary lateral sclerosis. And people with this is much rarer. They tend to live longer as well. And that predominantly causes spasticity, and increased tone. And people
Is that what Stephen Hawking said? Stephen Hawking.
I think he had ALS.
ALS. But he lived for a long time.
He lived for a really, really long time.
Like, he got it quite young.
He did. He did.
Like 40 or 30s
That's right,
or something like that.
And he was, that's an exceptional case. That's not usually the way,
but he's a good example of what I consider the spasticity effect, because he couldn't move. He didn't move.
He couldn't move. No, I think in the end he had a tracheostomy, didn't he? Yeah. Yeah, and that's a rare form. And then there's another form, PMA, which is primary muscular atrophy, and that is a flaccid. So as opposed to the sort of stiffness, people have a flaccid weakness. But the most common type is ALS, and we use that interchangeably with motor neuron disease. And I guess it is what it says. It predominantly affects the motor neurons. So going back to all those neurons in the brain there, the neurons themselves are specialised in a few different ways. One is into function. And so the motor cells are those that control our ability to walk, talk, eat, breathe, all of those physical functions. And in motor neuron disease, we predominantly have a disorder of those motor neurons. So it can present in a variety of ways, but generally people present with weakness, usually in a limb, or that can be in the speech and the swallow muscles, and then that progresses over time, over a short period of time, 2 to 3 years, where finally it usually affects the breathing muscles.
And they end up passing away from pneumonia.
That's usually the case.
Can I just share with you and the audience what happened in relation to my mother? Is interesting enough, you said, because my mother's quite a talkative person and loved to have a chat. And I would ring her most nights on my way home from work, mainly because I would say to Mum, I'm on my way home from work, which means she knew she had like 40 minutes. And I would say, I'm home, I'm going to go and have my dinner, which meant I could stop the conversation. God love her. But one night I remember driving home, and my mother didn't drink. And I was driving home, and my dad didn't mind a whiskey. My dad didn't mind a whiskey every now and then, but Mum didn't drink. And I said, "Hey, Mum, did you have a drink with Dad tonight?" And she said, "No, no way, no, dear." I said, "But your speech sounds a bit like you've been drinking.
Mm.
Anyway, I didn't think much of it. I thought, oh, maybe she just didn't want to tell me something. It's none of my business. She didn't sound drunk, just like a little bit slurred. And then that went on for a few weeks. And then I convinced her that she should go, and my brother and sister also. We convinced her that she should go to the doctor. We needed to get to see a neurologist. I got down to see a neurologist down here at St Vincent's, and then they sent her off to the BMC, Brain and Mind Centre, and that's she was diagnosed there. But the process, Emma, was that first her speech was slurred. Then she couldn't really speak, so she used to write everything down. She used to communicate by writing. But then she lost the movement of her hands. She couldn't smell properly. She couldn't taste properly. This is the progression. Then she couldn't walk. Her legs sort of gave way on her. But she could hold herself up. She was sort of quite strong, pretty determined woman. But then she was on like an A-frame type thing, whatever those things that we wheel around. Then eventually it got to the point where she couldn't control various things, bowels and things like that. And it got to a point where they put her into palliative care. And then she ultimately passed away from pneumonia. She because everything she'd take would end up, she couldn't swallow. So it gets into her lungs, and then infection occurs, and then they pass away. They stop breathing. And for anybody who's never experienced, I tell you, it's the worst thing to experience, because their brain is, she can think of everything. Her eyes were perfect. She could read and stuff, and she could observe and think like she could never before. It was like she was trapped.
Yeah.
A terrible outcome, and I just want to share that, but as a process. But one of the things I found out at the time, and this may well have changed, was that it's actually quite a prevalent disease amongst in Ireland and amongst people with Celtic backgrounds, and that I also found out, and maybe this is advanced because it was quite a while ago when she passed away, maybe about 8 years now, but one of the things I found out was that you can have the genetic mutation, but you can carry it your whole life and nothing ever happens to you. But under certain circumstances in lifestyle, they can sort of, I don't know, wake the mutation up. For example, alcoholism, exposure to poisons, or in her case, what they said to me, potentially what happened was a severe respiratory disease.
Okay.
So she got like, and it was like 1 year before she got MND, she had a really bad, she got the flu in the winter, and got really bad chest infection, and lost a lot of weight as a result of it. And literally about 3 months later, that's when she started these symptoms started to come on, and then in 6 months she was gone. She was 86, so she was in her 80s, but she was quite frail. But is that, can we just talk about that for a moment? Like, because a lot of Australians have Irish background or Celtic background, one way or the other, Scottish or whatever, Northern Europe. And let's talk about these mutations, because they don't really know which mutations were relevant, or at least they didn't been able to tell me. They sort of said there was category A, B, C, where there's correlations. In other words, people who've died from this disease had these mutations, on these particular genes, and that, say 50% of those people had this correlation, and then the category B was only 30%. Then category C is that, because people go and try and get tested. I did. And I went and tried to get tested for this stuff, and I was fine. I didn't have any of the current, back 4 years ago, current thinking. There may be new changes to that now. Could you explain that part to us about mutations? Then the mutation perhaps being set off later on in life as opposed to early disease. And maybe I got all that wrong. That's just my memory of it.
Yeah, no. I think that's a super interesting area, and it's something I've been particularly interested in throughout my academic career. And perhaps it is that Irish link as well, which has sparked that interest.
Same as, well, it definitely sparked my interest.
Yeah. And really interesting is that this one particular mutation, so about 10% of motor neuron disease cases are probably genetic,
Yep.
and the majority aren't. But this particular mutation is called the C9orf72 expansion. It's actually an expansion in a part of the DNA code. And that has been traced back to a single European founder.
Wow.
Yeah. And actually, you can trace how it sort of spread throughout Europe if you trace how the Vikings sort of plundered their way throughout Europe. So we see this specific mutation in sort of Europeans, particularly, but also we see it sort of in areas where the Europeans then spread to. So we don't see it in Asia very much, but certainly we see these strong clusters in Europe, particularly in Ireland, which obviously has a strong Celtic heritage, and also in the US. So that's fascinating. But we're born with it. Right, so when it's passed on in what's called an autosomal dominant inheritance pattern. What that means is, so you get 2 genes for everything. Basically, you get one from your mother and one from your father. If you inherit this abnormal gene, you just need 1 copy of the abnormal gene in order to be at risk of developing the disease. So that gives, if your parent has it, you have a 50% chance of carrying the gene.
If both parents have it?
If both parents have it, then I'm trying to work.
So we had 2 Irish parents, for example.
Yeah, you have a 75% risk.
Wow.
It's not that prevalent. It's not that prevalent. I wouldn't expect. You'd be very unlucky for two parents to carry it. So that's called this, as I said, the C9orf72, and that causes motor neuron disease, but that also causes a related condition called frontotemporal dementia.
Wow.
Which we
FTD.
FTD, which we touched on a little bit earlier. And for a long time before this mutation was discovered, they knew that there were families where there was clustering of both FTD and MND. And actually, there were some people who had both. And if you had a combination of both FTD and MND, you tended to have a worse prognosis. Things tended to escalate and deteriorate faster. So that sort of finding that gene was really instrumental in helping us understand how those 2 conditions overlap. So people with motor neuron disease, as you say, like your mum, usually their mind is bright, they don't have any change in behavior, but in a portion of people, they do have some of these features of FTD. And that can actually be really devastating for the families. In addition to having MND, you now have to try and deal with changes in behaviour, changes in personality, and that affects how people make decisions and, the sort of family dynamics and all of that. So finding that gene has consolidated that overlap, I guess, but also helps us as clinicians make sure that we're asking people the right questions, because people don't always volunteer.
Yeah, but why is it some people, this never expresses itself until they're 86, like in my mum's case?
So you asked me about that. Yeah. Well, that's another excellent question. There's been recent research that says in order for MND to be sparked off or kicked off, you need 6 separate steps.
Right.
So these sort of 6 separate things have to happen. And that could be exposure to a toxin, it could be a stress, it could be a life event. But if you have a genetic mutation, that number's reduced to 3.
Right.
So you're more vulnerable.
Right.
You only need 3 events to happen.
3 one or 3 or all 3?
3, but any 3 of any kind.
Any one of the types of things.
Yeah, and we don't know
what they all are.
Yeah. It's not uncommon for people to say that they've had a trauma just before the onset of motor neuron disease. I can think of one patient in particular who had fallen and broken their leg, and their leg was in a cast, and then when the cast came off and they were going through rehabilitation, they had a foot drop, and that was the start of MND.
Wow.
So some people have those stories where it's really clear and you can sort of identify a potential trigger, and other people it's less less obvious, but no doubt it seems like there are those particular steps to make people to I guess spark the onset of the disease.
Well, if it's only 10%, generally speaking, affected by the genetic mutation that they carry through their parents, the other 90%, what are the what's the hypothesis now around what causes that? Is there anything we can avoid or should avoid in order? Have you found anything that tells you that there's a problem in the way you're living your lifestyle, Mark, or the things you're not doing? Perhaps you're not exercising enough. But what should we be looking at to avoid these things?
Yeah, and for MND, that sort of flips all of the other lifestyle advice on its head
Oh,
a
really?
little bit, not completely, but to an extent, in that I guess what it tells us is maybe everything in moderation, because we know that MND is particularly prevalent in some sort of elite sports.
Wow.
Yes, yeah. So we don't fully really understand this yet, and that's another area of research which has been very sort of active recently. But certainly, there are some elite sports, particularly soccer players, where there is an increased risk of motor neuron disease. So whether that's it's hard to know. There's two theories to this, whether it's the actual exercise and the level of exercise that's contributing to that, or whether there's something in the genetic makeup of these people who are destined to sort of be, elite sports people, whether there's something in that genetic makeup that also makes them more vulnerable
To motor
to
neurons.
motor neuron disease. We don't know the answer to that yet, but I think, in that all of these avenues open up potential routes for better understanding of the disease, diagnosis and management. So I think it's really important that we explore all of this.
So if I go back to, as I understand, there's no cure for motor neuron disease at this stage. But if I go back to dementia, like you turn on the TV at home, for those who still do that type of thing, and it seems like every week there's a story on the national news about some new development in dealing with dementia, is usually what they're talking about. And I presume that they're usually talking about Alzheimer's, I think. Where's that up to now in terms of taking a pill or whatever there is that the big pharma's doing, or you guys are doing, or someone's doing? Are there any green shoots that we can now see in relation to dementia, for example, Alzheimer's?
Absolutely. And this is quite timely, I guess, because only in the last few weeks have we had an announcement from...
Oh, like recently?
Yeah. Just in the last few weeks, we've had an announcement from the TGA, the Therapeutic Goods Administration.
The Australian regulator?
Yeah, to say that they have now registered the first disease-modifying therapy for Alzheimer's disease in Australia.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it's therapy as in it being a drug?
It's a drug.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's called donanemab. It's actually an infusion. You have it every 4 weeks.
Like into your bloodstream?
Intravenous infusion every 4 weeks, for 18 months is what the trials have done so far. These are a type of drug called monoclonal antibodies.
Oh, so isn't that the same thing we use for COVID? Monoclonal antibodies, isn't that the same sort of antiviral that we got for COVID? Well, they were called the same thing, perhaps.
Yeah, monoclonal antibodies are used for lots of different conditions. Also, we use them a lot in multiple sclerosis. Basically, it's trying to harness sort of the immune system to target these proteins. That's certainly what we're doing in Alzheimer's disease. These are drugs that are made in a laboratory, obviously. They're called monoclonal antibodies. So what an antibody is produced when it as part of your immune system, when it's exposed to what's called an antigen or a protein. So what we're able to do not me personally, but what they're able to do in the lab is actually produce antibodies against this amyloid protein, and then they infuse it. Essentially, what those antibodies do is they bind to the amyloid and they pull it out of the brain.
Wow. And somehow expel it somehow through going to the bathroom,
yeah,
whatever the case may be.
yeah. And
So maybe you could just explain. I mean, I don't understand this part, but I've heard about it, where only certain types of things can cross the blood-brain barrier. Because is there some sort of barrier going around your brain to stop things getting into your brain that the brain doesn't want to be dealing with? How's that work?
essentially that's it, because we need to protect I think we need to protect our brain. The brain needs to protect itself from everything else that's going on in the body, and yeah, that's the term, blood-brain barrier. And essentially that can make it difficult for certain molecules, especially larger molecules, to get into the brain, and that's protective. But also when we're trying to treat these conditions, it makes it more tricky to how do we deliver these drugs so they will cross over the blood-brain barrier.
So these
more effectively.
monoclonal antibodies, I can't remember the name of the
That's
thing you
correct,
mentioned to me. They're obviously able to cross the blood-brain barrier,
They are.
the brain-blood barrier, whatever it is,
They are.
and get to these proteins
Mm-hmm.
and attach themselves to it and somehow exit them. How would we normally, just because as I understand it, we're all producing these amyloids and tau, etc., all the time, but somehow we manage to get rid of them clean them out every day or whenever. How does that work normally?
Yeah, so normally how we get rid of these
Yeah.
amyloid proteins.
So we don't build up excessive amounts.
Yes, there's a few different mechanisms for how we get
More
rid.
naturally.
Yeah, naturally, actually, during sleep is when we do a lot of clearing out of the toxins of
And
our
which
brain.
part of sleep? Because we have the light sleep, deep sleep, REM sleep. I mean, is there a part of the? Let's say I'm a light sleep, which I am. I'm a light sleeper, and I never really go into too deep a sleep. And we are trying to do something with you guys at Neura again. And by the way, Neura's been fantastic to us. Like there's such a depth of access and research, and like relevancy for this whole project, and for what Australians need to understand. But certain parts of sleep are really important for us to go into in order, as I understand it, for this clearing process to happen. With the garbage getting cleared out of your brain, if I can put it in vernacular. And we need this, because one of the things I remember, my mother, she never slept. She would sleep 4 hours a night for her whole life, and I often wondered whether that had some sort of part of why she got ill right at the end. And my father, on the other hand, he used to sleep like 8-9 hours every night. Like, no problem. Go to bed, gone. Wake up, didn't even move the whole night. And because I'm thinking about myself, So because sleep strategies and sleep systems, I think, have become more important for Australians to think about than ever before. Not because you just should sleep, but because of the sorts of things you're talking about, like clearing the brain out while you're, because that's what the brain's sort of trying to sort itself out. Maybe you could explain that a little bit.
Yeah, I've been thinking more about this myself as well.
Yeah.
Actually, the more we think about that process exactly, clearing the brain out, and how do we stop the buildup of these proteins. And actually, for many neurodegenerative conditions, people often have difficulties with sleep many years before the onset of symptoms. So there's definitely a relationship there. And particularly for Parkinson's disease, abnormal sleep is actually a huge part of the actual syndrome. But even for Alzheimer's disease, we know that people's sleep is often disrupted for years before. Now, is that a risk factor? Is that poor sleep contributing to the build-up and the lack of clearance? That's one question. Or is it actually a part of the disease?
Yeah, does one cause it, or does one an effect of it?
Yes, the chicken and the egg.
Yeah.
And I don't think we know the answer
really?
to that yet. And I think by one project that we're really interested in doing is studying these genetic carriers early early on before they develop symptoms to try and work out when do these sleep patterns emerge and how is it related to the pathology that we see in the brain, inflammation in the brain. How is that all related to help us work out what comes first, and should we be really targeting sleep? Is that something that us as a society need to think about more? So many people have poor sleep.
Yeah, totally.
So many people have poor
And or
sleep.
we just think it's okay, and or some people just think it's a badge of honor to, like, particularly, to be honest, in your game, in
Yeah.
the research game, because a lot of you guys, because I've had some experience with them, you're up to 2 o'clock in the morning
Yeah.
doing your work,
Yeah.
and then you might have kids, and you're up the next morning at 6 a.m. to get the kids off to school, and you just think, well, that's normal because that's what everybody in my profession does,
Mm-hmm.
and that can equally be applied to people who do shift work, people who do run businesses, etc. And I know a lot of people think, oh, I can get away sleeping 5 hours. Like, they're in their 30s. They say, I can get away with sleeping 5 hours a night. And to be honest, I was one of those people. So as I said, I thought of it as a badge of honor. Who needs to sleep? I used to say stupid things like, I will sleep forever one day.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I don't need to waste my time sleeping now.
Yeah.
That was my logic. The only problem I didn't realize is that I could actually be speeding my forever up. The onset of forever, I could be speeding that up by making that statement and living that lifestyle. So sleep is a big, important thing. Do you guys are you doing much research in the sleep in terms of its contribution to, like the things we just talked about, Alzheimer's, under the general dementia banner?
Yeah, that's something that we're really starting to look at and trying to build a research program around that. For example, we can look at MRI scans and we can use some of those different sequences to try and understand that what's called the glymphatic system, which is like the system that clears
Yep.
out the toxins. So there are new protocols that allow us to look at people's MRI scans and determine maybe the health, let's say, of their glymphatic system.
Do you do that whilst they're asleep? Do you do the MRI whilst they're asleep, or you can? They're awake when you do this?
They're awake
Yep.
when we do that. Ideally, it would be great to do some of this while people are asleep, and that's something we will look to perhaps in the future. But that's not that easy.
You have to change
to
the
do.
MRI machines before someone's going to go to sleep.
Yeah, well, exactly.
They're
It's
too
not
scary.
easy to fall. It's not easy to fall asleep inside.
Well, no,
people's-
what's worse, if you wake up and you open your eyes and you got this thing right there and you got this noise going on. That would just scare the bejesus out of me. Can I just before I wrap, and I really appreciate your time. It's been fantastic. Very, very edifying. Can I just ask you one more thing? You mentioned right at the beginning, as part of the DIAN program, you're looking at younger people. Because most people think of these things as old person's disease. And probably they mostly present when people are older anyway. But is there can you share with us, do young people actually get dementia, like someone in their 30s or 40s? Is that something that happens?
Yeah, unfortunately, yes.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean it's rare, thankfully, but it still happens. We have people in their 30s who have Alzheimer's disease. We have people in their 30s who have lost all the other members of their family through Alzheimer's disease. So yes, it definitely does happen. And again, that is rare. But even thinking about, frontotemporal dementia, FTD, even MND, I mean, that can affect people,
Very young. Yeah.
in their 30s and their 40s and their 50s. And, part of that, obviously, for the Alzheimer's disease, it's usually genetic. So it's usually they've sort of been passed down one of those genes from a family member. But what we're trying to do through the DIAN project is work out, is there a way that we can prevent Alzheimer's disease in these populations? And then that has broader implications for the entire neurodegenerative community. Because if we can prevent it in these younger people, perhaps we can prevent it in older people as well.
And just finally, I think you said that you are looking at not symptoms, but perhaps some sort of signs, whether they're in your blood or in something or other, very early that might be telling you that when, I might be 30, but when you're 60, we know that, Mark, when you're 60, you're going to get one of these diseases, one of these neurodegenerative diseases. But we can tell when you're in your 30s because of this, and this. Is this some research you're doing now to sort of work out really, really early stages
Yeah.
that someone that has a predisposition to this?
Yes, yeah, that's exactly part of what we're doing at Neura and with our sort of international partners is trying to work out, can we really pin down what this risk profile is, but also are there any good blood markers or markers in that spinal fluid that we can take an individual, and it's all about individualizing it, isn't it?
Yeah.
What is your own personal risk? Because we can say your risk is whatever, but that's meaningless really unless you can individualize it. So yeah, that's what we're trying to do. What we really need is sort of objective markers, something that we can measure, and if we repeat it again, we get the same result, and that's really what we're looking towards.
Or a change, like an increase.
An increase or a change, exactly.
Like we do with the PSA test.
Exactly.
For prostate cancer. Like,
exactly.
If you're 1.5 and somehow the next time you have your test, like you're 2.5, the delta, the change, the difference between the two sort of is indicative that could mean something's going to happen.
Exactly. And maybe we're moving towards that sort of an approach for dementia, a screening, we do cancer screening, right? Are we moving towards a world where we have dementia screening? And I think that would be ideal, but we need a whole lot of infrastructure. We need a whole lot of change in order to move to that space.
Or perhaps change an attitude too.
I think so.
Because we tend not to think about these things until we're getting older and someone else in our family's got it. We don't think of brain diseases the same way as we think of cancer or heart disease.
No, we don't.
Where do you, just finally, Emma, where do you see, where does Australia sort of rank? I mean, I don't mean that in a hard sort of core way, but are we up there with everybody else? Are we as good as everyone else in this research around neurodegenerative diseases, particularly at Neura? So, where do you think you guys are going? Like, you're happy with where you're at, relatively speaking, or you want more money, or what are you after? Everyone wants more money for research.
We always want more money.
Yeah, everyone's after money for research, but you know what I'm saying. Because Neura's a pretty big institution, and most people don't even know about it. Like, it's a big joint. It's got a beautiful building in Randwick. David Gonski loves being the Chancellor of the University of New South Wales. He's very proud of it. But not many people know about it, and I know it's doing great work. Where do you think you guys rank? Are you happy with where you're ranking?
I think we're ranking pretty good, but I think we also have a lot of potential, and I think you're going to see a lot of change, a lot of progress, particularly as we're in this really important phase for dementia. And I think Neura is we're ready to take on the challenge and to progress and be on an international stage. And I definitely think we're already there. Professor Kiernan recently was in a poll, international sort of poll, or looked at all different types of publications and things. He was ranked number 1 for motor neuron disease research globally. Yeah.
In terms of publications, or his name being on publications, you mean?
I'm not sure exactly
Something
what
like
the metrics were, but but certainly he was.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. So I think we're up there. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well,
and we have lots of big ideas.
Yeah,
and lots of big plans.
and lots of things to execute on. And by the way, it's a bigger place than most people get a sense of. Most people, fortunately, don't have to go there.
Yeah.
I've had the privilege of being there. I didn't have to go there. I had the privilege of going there, but and my team has. So, we should. And part of, to be frank with you, part of Project 100 is actually to build awareness for programs like what you guys are doing. It's not just about you parlaying to our audience things that they would like to know about these various diseases that we've been talking about today, neurodegenerative diseases. Every time I say that word, I think it's a hard word to say. Tell me, I just want a sense of Mark, you're okay, because every time I say the word neurodegenerative disease, I have to think about the degenerative path, and I think, is that your brain not working properly or not telling your tongue what to do? But But in terms of that, it's just as important for us to get content and to parlay that out to people as it is to showcase what great work Australia is doing, and particularly in this regard. And it's been it's quite a privilege to have someone like you come in. So, and I want to thank Neura for organising this and you coming along today. Dr. Emma, I want to say your name. I'd love to know how my mother would say it, but she's not here. But Dr. Emma Deveni.
I think that's how your mother would say
Yeah,
it,
she would.
actually. Yes. Yeah.
Good on you. Thanks
Yeah.
very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome.